Last night, I was called back to Ireland from my post in Dongtan. I was to assume the position of temporary flood commissioner in order to address a dramatic pattern of recurring floods that had come to dominate the Tolka River catchment within the last fortnight. Moments after my emergency appointment to this obviously fabricated position, I found myself in a flight to Dublin. Following my arrival and a claustrophobic taxi journey, I checked into a room on the top floor of a hotel looking out over the suburbs sprawling across the Tolka Valley before the nightly floods began. The second-generation superintendent of the Tolka region, who was still a young woman at the time, believed that a new development scheme was necessary if the Tolka was ever to be considered as a major river. It was rather bold of her to entrust the redesign of the flooded landscape to a young planner such as myself, whose experience was limited to a handful of unbuilt projects. My first and only phone call to her that night was short, but everything was decided quickly. I was to complete 4 new plans of the Tolka catchment addressing the issues caused by the flood within the next 24 hours. According to her, she relied on her intuition. Apparently, I was to do the same. Thinking about the river that night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed with the lights turned off. I'd nothing to do but stare at the dark ceiling. The space I was in certainly had shape, and the ceiling that I stared at was painted white. But once the lights were out, nothing had form. A monster of uncertain dimension appeared. It was shapeless and vague, and had the terrible capacity to swallow and dissolve every imagining. It was not really space, but a flood that occupied what used to be a space. It could only be a flood that swallowed up all that the naked human imagination had wrought. Staring into the flood, I allowed my mind to drift. From the viewpoint of the human observer, an encounter with a flood is a process of delving into the depths of his or her own personal consciousness. In this space of illusion, the human being is committed to a process of theoretical analysis, as the flood represents a pluralistic world of complex movement, rife with inherent contradictions. I woke the next morning and spent the day at the tiny desk in the hotel room, drafting 4 plans to address the flood. My first plan was to bury the river. In recent public lectures, I've often reminded my audience that Dublin, sited on an alluvial plain at the front of a rugged, unstable mountain range, has the worst flood problem of any major European city. My plan would be to deepen and armour a narrow width of the Tolka Channel in order to maximise potential commercial developments within the floodplain. Quite beneficial to large landowners, this strategy would effectively entomb the natural river in a concrete straitjacket that minimised its presence within the context of its surroundings. Unprecedented losses of property in recent floods have of course made flood control an urgent priority. At the same time, the local urban riparian interface must be reconstructed to take account of the huge population explosion of the past 20 years. Thus I propose that the valley temporarily solve its flood problem and assuage powerful floodplain landowners by killing or burying its river. Over the narrow channel that would confine the river, I proposed a series of bridges and highway overpasses that would ensure that the major geometrical and structural problems of this redevelopment would be accessible to individual perception. My bridges would be distinguished from the more common bridges by an unusual solicitude for the pedestrian, for the individual person, that is, to be set in a position to experience the bridge slowly and contemplatively. My understanding of these forms is that the designer can interest the user in the struggle to resolve the forces at work in such construction, in this case the conflict between land and water, by granting acute attention to materials and geometry. So in the designs that I proposed, enormous concrete elements would be pushed out of the easiest, most symmetrical alignments to show the movement of thought involved in even the most stable arrangements. This would clearly illustrate the tension between the river and the landscape, which had failed to contain it. I outline my second plan as follows. The district on the east side of the Tolka was once a rural outpost of the city, built of stone. Now, only very few traces are left of its historic structure. The district is currently characterised by production halls, trade workshops, illegal car parks and vacant sites. The river is completely blocked by streets. The urban layout of the flood zone, consisting of long, narrow plots, is primarily intended to connect these sites to the railway, forming a heterogeneous building line along the embankment, unclear as regards building heights and intermediate spaces. My second plan responds playfully to this existing parcel structure of the area. Cleared trade premises would successively be replaced by grids of trees and other planted areas. The different states of development and detailing of individual sections would result from the times of planting and thus reflect nature's cycle of decay and renewal. The design would not give priority to individual solitary plants, but to masses of the same species. Crops from all over the world would be cultivated on fields embedded in the linear forms of this garden and integrated into the natural irrigation system provided by the Tolka. A varied micro-landscape of different native soils would form the foundation for this extensive redevelopment. Sections of landscapes would be presented like exhibits in an art gallery on a neutral carpet. The western edge of the new site could be referred to as the water garden. The water plants growing in this grid of paths would be of great morphological variety. In years, the park would come to possess an excellent ecological environment, which would grow out of human effort to reveal a natural beauty. At its planning stage, this new park could be viewed as a placenta where life is to be gestated. Perceiving it from a grander historical and geographical vision, one could see the park itself being nurtured by its surrounding land, with the Tolka as its umbilical cord, the Irish Sea as its amniotic fluid, and Ireland or the earth as its matrix. My third plan was to substitute an ecology based around a massive consumer space for the existing unstable natural ecology of the flooded region. Shopping has historically preferred to do away with the outside, seeing nature as an unpredictable interference with the unfolding of commerce. Instead, it demands its own interior realms. The bazaar, the arcade, and finally the shopping mall all exist in a lineage of increasing control and increasing autonomy from exterior conditions. Within the comfort of the space that I proposed, free from the variables implicit within the natural ecology spurned by the recent flooding, shopping would become an ecology in its own right. If shopping is seen through an ecological lens, an incredible array of diversity, complexity, and flexibility in its structure and behaviour become apparent. Shopping is an endless web of flows and exchanges, of shoppers, retailers, goods, information, humanity, and money. Fluidity and flexibility, connectivity and continuity are crucial in this ecological web of shopping. The consumer space that I propose would be built to a scale, density, and pervasiveness that would operate more effectively as landscape than as architecture. This system of flood-proof interior spaces would consist of enticing environments where sound, scent, light, air, and even plants would all be manipulated to extract the desired response from consumers. Forcibly complicit in sponsoring commercial ecstasy, the previously unstable natural environment would be repurposed as repliscape, using the aura of the naturally familiar to disguise the mechanics of the synthetically composed. Repliscaped trees within the space would be formed from real trees grown in the Tolka Valley. Each segment of bark and leaf would be removed from the trees, drained of water content, dunked in embalming fluid, and then allowed to desiccate. Skilled artisans would be brought in to reconstruct the trees, weaving the bark segments into hollow PVC pipes. Steel receiver heads would be inserted at the top of these pipes with up to 40 receptacles for attaching preserved branches and leaves. These preserved trees would no longer need special planters. Instead, one could merely bolt the trunks to the floor, recreating the landscape of the Tolka Valley within a safe, endless interior. My fourth and final plan was to extend an existing network of boardwalks to their logical conclusion, so that they traverse the entirety of the flooded landscape, linking the existing parks so that they would become the region's most dominant feature. Boardwalks serve many purposes besides carrying pedestrians. These uses are bound up with circulation, but are not identical with it, and in their own right they are at least as basic as circulation to the proper working of parks. A boardwalk by itself is nothing, it's an abstraction. It means something only in conjunction with the landscape and other uses that border it. As they are frequently travelled public spaces, boardwalks might be seen as a park's most vital organs. As we move about these boardwalks, we are offered powerful vistas from one passage across the landscape and onto the adjacent passage, spaces we can visualise as before, then after, then before again. No previous architecture is so powerfully two-dimensional in its ability to impress on you continuously as you move through it, its functional, structural and mechanical origins. On that note, if a park's boardwalks are safe, the park is thereby tolerably safe from barbarism and fear. When people say that a park or a part of it is dangerous or is a jungle, what they mean primarily is that they don't feel safe on the boardwalks. Under the surface, this focus on the primacy of the boardwalk is an attack on current trends in post-flood landscaping. It is an attempt to introduce new principles, different and even opposite from those now taught in everything from schools of architecture and planning to the Sunday supplements and women's magazines. My attack is not based on quibbles about rebuilding methods or hair-splitting about fashion in design. It is an attack rather on the principles and aims that have shaped modern orthodox post-flood landscaping. That evening, I sat up looking out over the Tolka Valley as I had the night before. Not long after I had submitted my plans, I heard back from the superintendent. Following an intense battle between local stakeholders, my 4 proposals had been accepted. In fact, each one would be implemented along a different section of the river. Construction was to begin immediately. It had been a long day, but surveying the flood zone from the hotel window, I had one consolation. In one respect, at least, the battle that had been fought over these plans appeared to have ended, as my battles usually ended. However Pyrrhic my victory, it was still victory. Press and public might yell, but the trees were coming down. My bulldozers would be in operation by the morning, and no one in the city government was going to stop them. This fact became clear at midnight when the superintendent's press secretary issued a statement declaring, "The flood commissioner has the right to do what he is doing. The public, on the other hand, only has the right and the duty to stand by his decisions." The superintendent shunted a resolution demanding a review of my plans over to a committee that was scheduled for the following week, by which time the trees would all be down and the grass would be covered in concrete. My strategies would become reality. Don't be embarrassed for me if these plans seem a little childish. I would assume that you are aware that my approach differs somewhat in nature from what you have come to expect in relation to flood response planning. I suggest that you make a note of these differences and apply what you have learned from my response to this flood to your everyday experiences of other natural and urban spaces. You may suddenly discover, as I have, what might be considered to be a new spatial prototype.